When an elephant is young, trainers tie it with a small rope. The baby elephant pulls, struggles, fights, and fails. One day it stops trying. Years later, that elephant can break trees, move trucks, shake the ground, but the same small rope still holds it. Not because it's weak, because it believes it is. That rope is not around the elephant's leg, it's inside its mind, and most people are living exactly like that elephant. The first key point is this: your power did not disappear. Your belief slowly faded when life kept handing you moments that felt bigger than you. Think about a child learning to ride a bicycle. The first fall feels shocking, the second feels embarrassing, and by the fifth fall, the child starts saying, "Maybe I can do this." The muscles are still strong, the balance is still possible, but the mind begins to protect itself by shrinking expectations. Many adults walk through life with that same invisible voice, not because they lack strength, but because they once felt small at the wrong moment and decided that moment was their identity. Somewhere along the way, you started collecting labels that were never meant to stay. A teacher's careless comment, a failed business attempt, a relationship that ended and made you question your worth. Each experience left a tiny mark, like dust settling on a mirror. At first, you could still see yourself clearly. Over time, the reflection became dull, and you forgot what you looked like when you believed fully in your own ability. The strange thing is, nothing inside you actually broke. The skills, the curiosity, the courage, they simply went quiet while your mind replayed old scenes as if they were permanent truths. Imagine a man named Carlos who once loved drawing. In school, a classmate laughed at one of his sketches. It was a small moment, barely 5 seconds long, but it became the loudest voice in his head. Years later, Carlos works in an office, telling everyone he is not creative. One evening, his daughter asks him to draw a dragon with her. He hesitates, then tries. The lines feel awkward at first, but soon he forgets the old memory and loses himself in the joy of creating. Nothing magical happened to his talent that night. The only thing that changed was that he gave himself permission to try again without the old label guiding his hands. Your belief system works like a security guard who learned its job during your most vulnerable years. It stands at the door of your choices, trying to keep you safe from embarrassment, failure, or rejection. But sometimes that guard becomes too strict. It stops you from walking into rooms where you actually belong. It whispers you tried before and it didn't work. It shows you outdated footage of your life as proof. Meanwhile, your real potential waits patiently, like an athlete warming up on the sidelines, ready to step into the game the moment you stop listening to fear dressed as wisdom. There was a woman named Lena who avoided speaking in meetings because she once froze during a presentation early in her career. For years, she told herself she was not a speaker. One day, her team leader asked her to share a small idea with just 3 co-workers. Her voice shook, but she finished. Nothing dramatic happened. Nobody clapped. Yet something shifted inside her because she realized the disaster she had imagined never arrived. The belief that she was incapable began to crack, not because she suddenly became fearless, but because she experienced a small moment that contradicted the old story she had been repeating to herself. Your mind often confuses familiarity with truth. If you have repeated a limiting belief for 10 years, it starts to feel like a fact carved in stone. But beliefs are more like habits than laws. They grow stronger with repetition and weaker with new experiences. Think about someone who learned to swim after years of fearing water. The body was always capable of floating. The lungs were always able to breathe between strokes. The only barrier was the memory of a childhood scare that convinced them water was their enemy. When they finally stepped into a pool with patience and guidance, they discovered that their strength had been waiting quietly all along. Every time you challenge an old belief, you are not becoming someone new, you are returning to who you were before doubt settled in. You start noticing small signs of strength that you ignored before. finishing a task you once avoided, speaking honestly instead of staying silent, trying something unfamiliar without seeking approval. These moments may look ordinary from the outside, but inside they rebuild trust between you and yourself. That trust is the real source of power. It grows slowly, like roots spreading beneath the surface, invisible to others but strong, enough to hold you steady when life becomes unpredictable. And the more you observe your own journey with honesty, the more you realize that your past failures were never permanent verdicts. They were incomplete chapters written when you had less experience, less patience, less understanding of your own resilience. When you begin to see those moments as training instead of proof of weakness, something inside you relaxes. The heavy weight of "I can't" starts to feel lighter. You become curious again. You experiment again. And slowly, almost quietly, the power you thought you lost begins to move through your actions, your decisions, and your willingness to step forward even when your old beliefs try to pull you back. The second key point is this: the strongest beings are often controlled by the smallest thoughts, and most people never notice when that control begins. It doesn't arrive loudly, it slips in quietly, like a background hum you stop questioning. A single thought, such as "I'll do it later" or "this isn't the right time," feels harmless, almost reasonable. But when repeated enough times, it becomes a remote control for your life. Your body is ready, your skills are present, your opportunities are real. Yet one tiny sentence in your head decides when you move and when you stay frozen. Think about how a massive ship is guided by a small wheel. The wheel looks insignificant compared to the ocean and the steel body of the ship, yet a slight turn changes the entire direction. Thoughts work the same way. A man named Aaron once dreamed of opening a small cafe. He had savings, recipes, and even a location in mind. Every time he came close to acting, one thought showed up: what if I fail and look foolish? That thought didn't scream. It simply sat there, steady and calm. Years passed. The cafe never opened. Not because Aaron lacked courage, but because a single fear kept turning the wheel just enough to keep him circling the same safe waters. Small thoughts gain power when they pretend to be logical. They dress themselves as caution, humility, or realism. A woman named Nisha told herself she wasn't applying for a promotion because she needed more experience. The truth was, she was already doing the work unofficially. But the thought sounded responsible, so she trusted it. When someone else got the role, she felt confused and frustrated, yet part of her recognized the pattern. She hadn't been blocked by the company. She had been paused by a thought that felt sensible but quietly kept her in place. These thoughts often borrow energy from the past. They say, "Remember last time?" as if one experience represents the whole future. A runner who once pulled a muscle starts running slower, not because the injury remains, but because the memory of pain whispers caution at every step. The body healed long ago, but the mind still flinches. In life, that flinch can shape careers, relationships, and self-worth. People stop reaching not because they are weak, but because their thoughts keep replaying moments that no longer deserve control. There was a man named David who avoided deep relationships because one heartbreak years ago convinced him that closeness always leads to loss. He told himself he was independent, strong, and self-sufficient. In reality, a small thought had built a wall around his emotional world. That thought felt protective, but over time loneliness crept in, and David couldn't understand why. The strongest part of him, his capacity to care deeply, was being restrained by a single belief that never updated itself with new experiences. The most dangerous thoughts are the ones that feel familiar. You don't argue with them. You don't question them. They feel like part of your personality. "I'm just not confident. I'm bad at starting things. I don't handle pressure well." These statements slowly become instructions. The mind hears them and adjusts behavior to match. Over time, you forget they were once just passing ideas. They turn into identities, and identities become cages that look comfortable because you've lived in them for so long. But here is the quiet shift that changes everything. The moment you start observing your thoughts instead of obeying them. A woman named Elena noticed that every time she was about to speak up, a thought said, "This isn't important." One day, she spoke anyway. The room didn't collapse. No one dismissed her. In fact, someone nodded in agreement. That single moment didn't make her fearless, but it exposed the lie. The thought was not a rule. It was just a suggestion that had been promoted to authority without her consent. When you realize that thoughts are not commands, something loosens inside you. You begin to see that strength doesn't disappear under fear, it waits beneath it. Each time you act despite a small limiting thought, you reduce its influence. It becomes quieter, less convincing. You don't need to silence your mind completely. You only need to stop letting it decide everything. And slowly, as you choose action over automatic thinking, the balance of power shifts back where it belongs, with you moving forward while the smallest thoughts lose their grip and fade into the background where they were always meant to stay. The third key point is this: stop testing your strength using old limits, because the version of you who failed before is not the one standing here now. Yet most people keep asking the same outdated question inside their heads: can I do this? And they are asking it with evidence from years ago, when they had less patience, less clarity, less understanding of themselves. It's like checking today's weather using last year's forecast and wondering why it doesn't match. You have grown quietly, invisibly, in ways you don't give yourself credit for, but you keep measuring your present using a ruler from the past. There's a man who once tried to start running at 40 and gave up after 2 weeks because his body hurt and his breath felt heavy. He told himself, "I'm not built for this." 10 years later, his doctor warns him about his health, and something inside him shifts. He starts again slowly, walking more than running, listening instead of judging. This time, the body responds differently, not because the body changed overnight, but because the man did. The mistake would have been assuming that the earlier failure was proof of permanent inability, instead of recognizing it as an early attempt made without the patience he now has. Old limits are often built in moments of confusion, fear, or lack of guidance. They were never designed to define your future, only to explain your past. Yet many people treat them like fixed laws. A woman named Priya once failed a math exam and decided she was bad with numbers. For years, she avoided anything involving calculations. Later in life, running a small business forced her to confront finances. To her surprise, she didn't struggle the way she expected. With real motivation and context, the subject finally made sense. The old limit wasn't about intelligence, it was about timing, environment, and belief. You change faster than your self-image does. Skills evolve, perspective sharpens, emotional strength deepens. But the mind is lazy, it prefers familiar stories, even if they no longer serve you. So it says, "Remember how hard this was," instead of asking, "Who am I now?" That question matters, because the strength you test determines the result you accept. When you test yourself using old limits, you guarantee small outcomes. When you test yourself as you are today, you open space for surprise, growth, and quiet confidence. Think about someone who learned to drive and failed the test the first time. The nerves, the pressure, the unfamiliarity all came together in one moment. If that person decided, "I'm just a bad driver," and never tried again, they would be mistaking a snapshot for a whole movie. But most people try again, they practice, they pass, and soon driving becomes second nature. Life challenges deserve the same fairness. One attempt does not get to define your capability, especially when the person attempting has evolved since then. There's also a subtle comfort in using old limits. They protect you from disappointment. If you assume you can't do something, you never have to risk being wrong. But safety comes at a cost. A man named Thomas avoided public speaking because he once forgot his words during a college presentation. Years later, his ideas stayed trapped inside him, while others with less insight spoke freely. The limit wasn't fear of speaking, it was fear of revisiting an old version of himself that no longer existed. When he finally spoke at a small gathering, he realized the memory had been louder than reality. Every time you face a new challenge, you are allowed to reset the measurement. You don't owe your past any loyalty. You are not betraying who you were by becoming more capable. In fact, you are honoring the effort it took to get here. When you stop dragging old limits into new situations, you start noticing how much stronger your footing feels. Your voice steadies. Your decisions carry more weight. Not because the world suddenly became easier, but because you stopped asking permission from outdated beliefs. The moment you test your strength, fresh, without comparing it to an old failure, you give yourself an honest chance. You begin to meet challenges with curiosity instead of dread. You try, adjust, and try again without turning every setback into a personal verdict. And somewhere in that process, you realize that many of the limits you feared were never about your capacity at all. They were about the story you kept repeating long after the chapter had already ended. The fourth key point is this: comfort is the new cage. And most people don't realize they are locked in because the bars feel soft. Comfort doesn't announce itself as danger. It whispers, "This is fine," even when something inside you feels quietly restless. You wake up, follow routines that don't challenge you, repeat days that blur together, and call it stability. But deep down, there's a dull press. Sure, like wearing shoes that don't hurt enough to remove yet never feel right. Comfort doesn't break you suddenly. It slowly convinces you that this is all there is. There's a man named Robert who worked the same job for 12 years. It paid the bills, gave him predictability, and never demanded more than he could give on autopilot. People called him lucky, but every Sunday evening, he felt a strange heaviness he couldn't explain. Not sadness, not anger, just the sense that something inside him was shrinking. He told himself he should be grateful, that wanting more was selfish. Comfort taught him to confuse peace with stagnation, and over time that confusion made his world smaller without him noticing. Comfort often wears the mask of responsibility. It tells you that staying is mature, that risk is reckless, that wanting growth means you're dissatisfied or ungrateful. A woman named Maya stayed in a relationship that felt empty because it wasn't painful. There were no fights, no drama, no obvious reasons to leave, but there was also no excitement, no growth, no feeling of being truly seen. Comfort told her, "At least it's safe." Years later, she realized safety without connection had quietly drained her sense of aliveness. The cage wasn't built from fear. It was built from acceptance of less. Think about how animals behave in controlled environments. When food arrives on schedule and danger disappears, movement reduces, muscles weaken, instincts fade. The same thing happens to human potential. When life stops demanding effort, you stop discovering what you're capable of. You don't fail. You don't fall. You simply plateau. And plateaus are dangerous because they feel a key arrival even though they're just pauses that last too long. Comfort trains your mind to avoid discomfort at all costs, even when discomfort is the doorway to growth. A young man named Ethan wanted to start his own business, but every evening he chose familiar distractions instead. Scrolling, watching, numbing, none of it was harmful on its own. But together, they formed a routine that kept him exactly where he was. Comfort didn't tell him, "Don't chase your dream." It said, "You can do it tomorrow." And tomorrow kept moving while his confidence slowly faded from lack of use. The cruelest part of comfort is that it slowly rewrites your identity. You stop seeing yourself as someone who tries, risks, explores. You begin to see yourself as someone who maintains, manages, survives. Your language changes. "That's just how I am. I'm not built for that. I'm past that stage." These phrases feel calm, even wise, but often they are just the echo of comfort defending its territory. Growth feels noisy to comfort. It disrupts routines. It introduces uncertainty. So comfort convinces you that silence is better. There was a woman named Claire who always wanted to learn music but never started because life felt too busy. Years passed. One day, she heard a street performer playing a simple tune, and something inside her cracked open. She realized it wasn't time she lacked, it was permission to be uncomfortable again. The awkwardness of learning, the frustration of sounding bad, the vulnerability of being a beginner, all things comfort had taught her to avoid. When she finally picked up an instrument, the early days were messy, but she felt more alive than she had in years. Comfort doesn't disappear on its own, it tightens when challenged. The moment you step outside it, your mind protests. It reminds you of what you could lose, rarely of what you could gain. But that resistance is often the clearest signal that you're approaching something meaningful. When you choose discomfort intentionally, learning something new, speaking honestly, changing direction, you wake up parts of yourself that had been asleep. Not because discomfort is the goal, but because growth refuses to live inside padded walls, and the life you imagine requires more space than comfort will ever allow. The fifth key point is this: break the rope once, and your mind will never forget what freedom feels like. You don't need constant proof of your strength. You need a single moment that rewrites what you believe is possible. The mind is stubborn, but it is also honest. Once it witnesses real evidence, it cannot pretend it didn't happen. That first break might be small, quiet, almost invisible to others, but inside you, it sounds like thunder. It's the moment you realize, I did that, and no one can take that truth away from you. Most people wait for confidence before they act, not realizing confidence is born only after action. A woman named Rachel avoided traveling alone for years because she believed she wasn't capable of handling problems by herself. One missed flight, one unfamiliar city, one wrong turn felt like disasters in her imagination. One day, circumstances forced her to go. She was scared the entire first day. She figured things out slowly, awkwardly. When she returned home, something subtle had changed. She didn't become fearless, but her mind could no longer say, "We can't handle this." The rope had snapped once and the echo stayed. That first break changes how you interpret future fear. Before, fear felt like a warning sign telling you to stop. After, fear feels like a doorway asking if you're willing to step through. A man named Jordan was terrified of quitting his safe job to start something of his own. He finally did it, not perfectly, not confidently, but decisively. The first few months were hard, but every challenge he solved added weight to a new belief: I figure things out. Even when his business later struggled, his old fear never fully returned. The rope was gone. Doubt tried to tie him again, but it couldn't hold the same way. What makes the first break powerful is not success, but proof of movement. You don't need the outcome you dreamed of, you need the experience of acting despite resistance. Think of a person who finally speaks up after years of silence. The voice may shake, the words may not land perfectly, but once spoken, silence no longer feels inevitable. The mind remembers the sound of its own courage. That memory becomes a reference point, something solid to stand on the next time fear shows up, pretending to be authority. Many people stay trapped because they underestimate how little it takes to change everything internally. They think transformation requires dramatic victories. In reality, one honest attempt is enough. A student who believed she was bad at exams finally studied differently, asked questions, and passed one difficult test. That single result didn't make her brilliant overnight, but it erased a lie she had carried for years. The mind respects results, not intentions. Once it sees effort leading somewhere, even a small somewhere, it updates the story it tells about you. There is also something deeply personal about the first break. It doesn't happen on a stage or in front of applause. It happens when no one is watching. When you choose to wake up early instead of quitting again. When you send the message you've been avoiding. When you walk into a room you once felt unworthy of entering. These moments don't look heroic, but they are private revolutions. The mind treats them as evidence, quiet, undeniable evidence that you are not who you thought you were. After the first break, your relationship with failure changes. Failure no longer feels like confirmation of weakness. It feels like information. You become less fragile because your identity is no longer built on avoidance. A man named Leo once avoided learning new skills because he hated being bad at things. After forcing himself to learn one difficult skill and surviving the discomfort, his entire approach shifted. Being bad no longer threatened his self-worth. The rope that tied him to perfection snapped, and in its place grew curiosity and resilience. Once you've broken the rope, even partially, your mind stops cooperating with excuses. Old thoughts still appear, but they feel outdated, like advice from someone who hasn't seen your growth. You may still feel fear, hesitation, or doubt, but they no longer define the outcome. They become background noise instead of the director of your life. And from that point on, every new challenge carries a quiet reminder inside you, not loud, not dramatic, just a steady knowing that if you pulled free once, you can pull again, and the rope will never feel as strong as it once did. The sixth key point is this. Discipline is how giants wake up, quietly and without fanfare, long before anyone notices their effort. Discipline doesn't wait for inspiration. It doesn't knock politely and ask if you're ready. It shows up every day in small, invisible ways when you choose consistency over convenience. Think about a person who decides to learn an instrument. The first hour is awkward. Fingers fumble, timing fails, and frustration whispers, maybe this isn't for you. But the person who returns tomorrow and the day after gradually builds muscle memory, patience, and intuition. That is discipline. It doesn't create magic in a single night. It slowly tunes the mind and body until the impossible begins to feel normal. Many people misunderstand discipline because they expect it to feel heroic. They imagine someone bursting out of bed at 5 a.m., muscles glistening, full of energy and unstoppable determination. In reality, discipline often looks like the opposite. It is showing up tired. It is choosing to act even when the mind screams for comfort. A writer sits down with nothing but a blank page and the memory of failure. The fingers shake, and the inner critic says, "Don't bother." Discipline says, "I will sit anyway." And over months, years even, those small acts build an internal gravity so strong that doubt can no longer push you off course. Discipline is not punishment, it is quiet self-respect. There was a man named Victor who promised himself he would exercise for health, not appearance. The first month he hated it. The second month his muscles ached and every day felt heavy. But he continued, not for the mirror, not for approval, but to honor the promise he made to himself. That internal commitment changed him far more than any visible transformation. He realized that when you discipline yourself in ways that matter to your inner truth, you awaken strength that wasn't dependent on circumstance or external recognition. The subtle power of discipline is that it creates momentum in the unseen spaces of life. Consider a mother balancing a job, a home, and her own dreams. Every early morning she dedicates to learning a new skill. Every late night she uses to complete a personal project. These actions rarely get applause, yet they compound. Months later, the skill has improved, the project is nearly finished, and the sense of accomplishment carries her confidence forward. Discipline works silently, unseen, until one day the results are undeniable and what once seemed impossible now feels earned. Discipline is also about presence, about showing up when the world does not remind you to. A student preparing for a crucial exam doesn't practice only when motivated or when reminded by a teacher. The student who succeeds studies while tired, while bored, while distracted, because they have trained their mind to follow action rather than emotion. That is the quiet genius of discipline. It detaches success from mood and attaches it to habit. When action is inevitable, the mind learns to respect itself, and confidence grows naturally from repetition rather than chance. There is a deep rhythm in disciplined living, one that feels almost like harmony with yourself. A painter who wakes up daily to sketch, even imperfectly, begins to see growth that cannot be rushed. A musician practicing scales at odd hours notices a subtle clarity of thought, a sharpness of focus, a confidence in improvisation. Discipline carves pathways in the mind as much as in the body. It is the repeated small choices, the ones no one sees, that prepare you to act decisively when opportunity finally arrives. Giants do not stumble into success, they quietly build the terrain beneath their feet. Finally, discipline changes your relationship with temptation and distraction. A young man named Eli loved the idea of being a leader, but spent his evenings scrolling endlessly through content that left him restless. One day, he committed to replacing even a single hour of scrolling with reading and reflection. At first, the temptation to quit was constant, but as weeks passed, the brain began to rewire itself. Focus became a muscle. Patience became familiar. The minor discomfort of resisting instant gratification became less frightening than the regret of wasted potential. Discipline had created a structure where freedom could thrive, and the giant within him began to awaken quietly, steadily, without theatrics. The seventh key point is this: you are never meant to be tied, and the ropes you see around you are often illusions you learn to accept. Life has a way of showing up with small restrictions, subtle rules, and invisible fences that make you believe limitation is normal. A young boy named Sam was told repeatedly that he was not the athletic type. He carried that label for years, avoided physical challenges, and measured himself against others who seemed naturally gifted. It wasn't the world keeping him down, it was the story he allowed himself to believe. The rope was never real. It was a perception, strengthened, aided only by repetition and hesitation. Most people treat fear as authority, letting it dictate their boundaries, while forgetting that fear is just information, not law. A woman named Nadia avoided speaking in public because of one humiliating moment in college. Every new opportunity felt like stepping into danger. She rehearsed worst-case scenarios endlessly. But one day she whispered to herself, "What if I try anyway?" and walked onto a stage for a small group. Her voice wavered, her knees shook, and the audience barely noticed. What she felt wasn't courage being born, it was the rope loosening for the first time. The mind remembered the experience forever, and the illusion of being tied began to fade. Ropes are often reinforced by comparison. We look at others and think their success is unattainable, their talent permanent, their luck inevitable. A young man named Raj spent years admiring colleagues' promotions, feeling smaller by the day, convinced that the system had chosen everyone else and left him behind. One evening, he started a small project at home, hidden from eyes that judged, and realized he could create, solve, and deliver in ways he never gave himself credit for. The rope had never been around his potential. It was the invisible weight of self-imposed limitation, strengthened by looking outward instead of inward. The strangest part is that ropes often feel safe. They give a false sense of stability while quietly shrinking your life. A woman named Clara stayed in a job that bored her, surrounded by people who offered approval but not challenge. She told herself she should be grateful. Years later, she realized that the comfort she had mistaken for security had been a cage. Stepping outside felt terrifying, but the moment she took the first real step, she understood the ropes were never tied to her ability. They were tied to habit, expectation, and fear of the unknown. Breaking free begins with noticing the smallest chains, the subtle thoughts, The quiet I can't or maybe I shouldn't that repeat themselves in the mind. A man named Andre discovered that the biggest limitation in his life wasn't the world or circumstance, it was the voice inside that kept replaying old stories of failure. When he acted anyway, choosing one step that felt uncomfortable but necessary, the rope gave way. It didn't break with a loud snap, it shifted silently, leaving him stunned by how little had been holding him back compared to how much he had imagined. Freedom grows with repetition. One step leads to another, and slowly the mind learns that limitation was never permanent. A woman named Elise feared writing a book for years because she imagined rejection, ridicule, and failure. She wrote 1 page a day, silently, without telling anyone. Each page chipped away at the belief that she couldn't. Eventually, she had a manuscript, not perfect, but hers. The rope she had been imagining for decades had never been as strong as she thought. Every new action reinforced that the only thing tying her was her own doubt. The true power of realizing you were never meant to be tied is subtle but seismic. Once you feel the weight lift even slightly, your perspective changes. You start noticing opportunities you previously ignored, trusting instincts you previously silenced, and daring actions you previously postponed. A man named Victor finally approached a business idea he had been avoiding for years. The fear was still there, but the rope was gone, and for the first time, his energy flowed toward creation instead of hesitation. When you recognize that nothing was ever meant to hold you down, the mind begins to expand quietly, insistently, in ways that ripple into every corner of life. And now, when you pause and let all of this settle, you begin to see the truth quietly, without fanfare. The strength you need has always been inside you. The ropes you imagined were never as binding as your mind made them seem. The fears, the doubts, the old stories, they were only markers pointing toward where growth was waiting. Life does not ask for perfection, it asks for presence. It asks for the courage to keep showing up, to take one honest step after another, even when the outcome is uncertain. You are not defined by what you once feared, what you once failed at, or the limits you once accepted. Each choice to act, each small decision to trust yourself again, begins to rebuild the foundation of who you are. The mind learns through experience, and every time you move despite hesitation, you teach it something new. That you are capable, that you are resilient, and that your capacity is far beyond what you give yourself credit for. There is a quiet power in understanding that growth is steady, not sudden. It is built in the small, invisible moments where no one else is watching. It is found in the discipline of your mornings, the persistence of your actions, and the willingness to keep testing yourself in ways your old self never dared. That power is yours. It does not demand applause. It does not need validation. It only needs you to honor it, one choice at a time. So carry this understanding with you. Life is not about proving anything to anyone else. It is about proving again and again to yourself that you are capable of more than the version of you that once doubted. The rope may appear, fear may whisper, comfort may lure, but none of it has the authority you once granted it. You are stronger than any story that ever held you back. And in that quiet, steady knowing, there is freedom, not loud or sudden, but deep, enduring, and real. It is a freedom that comes from understanding your own mind, your own power, and the simple truth that you were never meant to be limited. You have the capacity to walk into your life fully awake, fully present, and fully aware of the strength that has been quietly waiting for you all along. When you step forward now, it is not with urgency or desperation, but with calm certainty. You are grounded in what matters, your resilience, your clarity, and the knowledge that the only real limits are the ones you choose to believe. And choosing differently, starting today, is entirely in your hands. Carry that quietly with you, let it live in your thoughts, guide your actions, and shape your days. There is a new rhythm in your mind now, a sense of trust in yourself that will not fade. The elephant within you has remembered its own strength and it will not forget